Hello, historians. We are doing our final lesson on the American Constitution. Sure seemed quick compared to our other ones, right? Well, we covered a lot of stuff in a very little amount of time, so definitely feel free to reach out and ask any questions if you feel a little lost on any of these things. But so far, I'm liking what I'm seeing. You guys are doing very well. So, yesterday we learned about the beginning of the American Constitution, what they were trying to do, and how the delegates, a delegate, friends, are the people that were elected to represent states, like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. All of those men were delegates of their state. So we talked about how right after, or actually during the Revolutionary War, the Second Continental Congress, they developed the Articles of Confederation, which was the first form of national government in the United States. And because of their fear of a strong central government, the delegates decided to be very limited with their power that they gave to the central government, which is really kind of a great foundation of what our Constitution is today. It's very limited. However, the Articles of Confederation were very weak because it literally had very little power. It had no power hardly at all. They could do things, but because of the fear that the people that were in the national government, the central government, being too powerful, it made that government very weak, and it really kept the states not united. Every state had their own constitution, and each of their own constitutions were kind of like little mini countries. And so the states had a lot of power where the national government had very little. So it made the government, it made it hard for the government to protect the freedoms of the people because they didn't have any power. The states were kind of on their own. So we talked about that. We talked about how they met again at the Continental Congress, and how really Madison, he was kind of sneaky. He tried to tell everybody that they were going to meet at the Second Continental Congress to talk about amending or changing the Articles of Confederation, but what he really wanted was to scrap it, throw it away, and start over. And that is essentially what they eventually did. They made a lot of concessions. They did a lot of talking, and we're going to talk about that today. So we talked about the beginning, and today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution, the supreme law of the land. So our objective, your objective today, is that you can answer questions about the United States Constitution, kind of what is in that Constitution and why it was put there. The questions that you're going to answer are part of your success criteria. Your success criteria is that you're going to be able to complete an exit ticket by correctly answering the questions. And that exit ticket, friends, is this Google form right here. Okay, you're going to complete this exit ticket and send it. This grades automatically, and these two, the one from yesterday as well, also go into Mastery Connect, so keep that in mind. You can retake these, so if you felt like you wanted to retake them, you can. But by answering these questions correctly, you were successful in learning what you needed to learn today. So that is our objective and success criteria. So let's talk about, well, I've kind of talked about what we did learn already. So now they met at the Continental Congress, and it was decided once and for all that they were going to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. They were going to throw it out, and they were going to start a new government, a new constitution. And that sounds like it was really easy, and it was easy to just get going. However, now the delegates had to debate, they had to strategize just how they wanted to make this strong central government, how to make a government strong, but also create a republic government where the people being governed have the say in how it is ran. So basically they're saying, make a government that's really strong, but not strong enough that they can take over things like a king does. So not making it the main, like almost where one person is the most powerful. They needed to come up with a way to give it power, but also limit the power. So it's kind of contradictory. So they had a really, really big task. And so to break down what you're going to talk about, what we're going to learn about today, is that first, we're going to talk about how they came up with checks and balances. This is all part of how they came up with their government. We're going to talk about the convention completing their work, meaning like everything else they added to the Constitution. That's pretty important to remember. We're going to talk about the states ratifying the Constitution. So that means approving the Constitution, and our Constitution today. So it seems like we're covering quite a bit, and it is kind of a quick cover of such an important document, but hopefully you get enough to be able to successfully answer those questions. So you've heard me use this term before when we were talking about Utah state government, checks and balances, and it is a very extremely important concept when it comes to government, and it was a revolutionary idea that was developed at the Continental Convention. And so we're going to kind of talk about how they came up with this idea. Let's start with the federal system. So no one wanted the central government to have all the power and leave the states with none. That was kind of the fear. So right now, under the Articles, the states had all the power, and they needed to change that. But then they were afraid about giving away too much power. So it was just a very, very difficult idea to figure out how to come up with a solution. And what they ended up creating was something in between, kind of like right in the middle, where the powers are divided between the central government and the state governments. So the central government is the national government. So now they have more power and the states have less power, but they're kind of like both in the middle. They kind of meet in the middle. This is called a federal system, the federal system. And it's the idea that it gives each level of government, the state and national, a job that it can do best. So like a state government, they do really well at holding elections, dealing with their state government, the stuff that's going on within their state. The national government does a really good job of national taxes, building schools, all those kinds of things fall under the national government system. So they both have very important jobs, but they have jobs that their part of the government's better at doing. So they meet kind of in the middle. They're like a perfect team. And it sounds like it's really easy to come up with this, but it's really not. It's not an easy thing to do. So if that wasn't hard enough, they also had to create a government that had enough power to act, meaning do things for its citizens, but not so much power that it could also threaten those citizens' freedoms. So they could do something without having to ask permission, and they could just act right away and fix a problem, but not so much power that because they can act, they can take away people's freedoms. And so, because that's kind of what they ran into with a king. A king had a power to do whatever he wanted. He could protect his people, and many kings did. There were a lot of great kings. But there were some bad ones too, and they did take away people's freedoms because they could, and that's what they wanted to avoid. So they came up with this idea of the separation of powers, and this was an amazing idea. The Virginia Plan, we talked about at the convention, came up with a solution to giving the central government a lot of power so that they could act and they can do what they needed to do to run a country well, but not too much power that they could take away freedoms or threaten the people of the country. And it said to take the new government and separate it into 3 separate and equal branches. So rather than having a king who runs everything, making the central government 3 separate branches. And each branch would have its own separate duties and powers. And this is still in our Constitution today. We have 3 separate branches of government, and all the branches are important, they're powerful, but they're not the most powerful. All of them work together. So there's not one person. I know you're thinking of the President of the United States, but he has two other branches that help him run the country. And that's the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. So the legislative we have talked about this in Utah state government, by the way, is Congress. It's the Congress that they kind of have already had. It's a group of people who make the laws for the country, and they are elected people. They're people that the people of their states vote for. And the people in Congress, they are called legislators. That's what their job is. Whereas I'm a teacher, if I worked for the legislative branch, I would be a legislator. So they're making the laws, they're writing the laws, they're coming up with laws. And then you have your executive branch, and this is headed by your President of the United States. He's the head of the executive branch, and he sees that the laws are carried out, meaning he's enforcing those laws. He's making sure that the laws just don't sit there and nothing happens with them. Things like freedom of speech. He's making sure that everybody has the freedom of speech. And he's also responsible for really kind of running the government. He's kind of like the boss, but he's a boss that has people that check in on him, and I'll get to that here in a minute. He also deals with other countries and is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So he's the leader of the military. So he has some pretty important jobs. But he also has a lot of rules he has to follow that the legislative branch, well, again, I'll get to that in a minute, but the legislative branch makes sure that he follows those laws. And then you have your judicial branch. The judicial branch, judicial. These guys are the judges of the laws. This is made up of your Supreme Court and other federal or national courts. They decide cases that involve the Constitution and the laws that Congress passes. So they take laws, and when people break those kind of laws, it's not like a traffic ticket, and it's not like a law where you're like robbing. That's not the kind of laws that people are breaking. They're breaking laws like let's take for example, if there's a newspaper and they write something that a lot of people don't agree with, well, in the Constitution, under the legislative branch, people have the right to write, the press has the right to publish whatever they want to say without being afraid of being arrested. So say this person who wrote this article is arrested. It would be the job of the judicial branch to give that person a trial and decide, did they break the Constitution or not? And in that case, they probably didn't. And so then they would have to just rewrite a law or change the law, or, end that person's trial. So they decide basically if people's freedoms are being threatened. So if they think that a person's freedoms are being threatened, then that's called unconstitutional, and that's what the Supreme Court oversees. They don't take on like criminal cases or anything like that. They take on cases strictly to do with the Constitution. So this is where I was talking about, I was going to get to in a minute. Checks and balances. This is the big idea here. You've got your three branches. And under the Virginia plan, that separated the power. So there wasn't one branch that was the most powerful. But how does that work? How does the president not just take over and do everything because he has a lot of duties? Well, it's all done with checks and balances. So each branch has a lot of power, but none is completely free to do what it pleases. That is because each branch can check or stop, that's another word for it, the other branches if they needed. So if the president is doing something that the legislative branch doesn't think he should be, they stop him from doing it. Okay, so that's the idea, is that they're kind of monitoring each other all the time to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to for the best of the people of the United States. So each branch checks and balances the others. So more on checks and balances is that Congress can pass any law it wants, but the president, so this is some examples, by the way. So Congress can pass any law it wants, but the president, who's part of the executive branch, can veto. or deny that law. So that's a part of that checks and balances. If they pass a law and the president's like, oh no, that's too powerful, or that's not good for the people of the United States, he can say, nope, never mind, and it's denied. And the president can make treaties with other countries, meaning that he can make peace treaties, or he can make deals with other countries. But that deal can only go into effect or only work if the Senate, the legislative branch, approves it. So even though he has a lot of power, he can make the deal, but he can't really sign the dotted line until the legislative branch approves it for sure. So the power is spread out and balanced among the three branches because each branch has the ability to check or stop the other two. Oh, here's another example. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, meaning that he is in charge of the entire military. However, he cannot declare war. Only Congress can declare war. That Congress is your legislative branch. So just because he can head up the military doesn't mean he can just send the military anywhere without permission. And that's how the power is spread out. So let's talk about compromises, because this was a lot of debating. This took a long time. People talked and spoke and gave arguments to everything. So during the Constitutional Convention, there was a lot that needed to be decided and debated on. There was so many things to talk about. And often the delegates had to just agree to compromise in the Constitution because a lot of people wanted something, but it was never going to happen unless other people agreed. So they came up with lots of different compromises. And a compromise is a settlement of a disagreement in which each side gives up something. So lots of us compromise day to day all the time. So we're going to talk about some really big compromises, and there's one called the Great Compromise that I want you to listen for. So they first had to, one of the very first compromises was they had to agree on whether there would be one house of Congress or two. Okay, that was a big one. Because remember they had talked about population and how many votes each state was going to have. And big states and little states had very different opinions about this. Big states didn't think that every state should have the same amount of votes, whereas little states thought so because they wanted their state to be represented equally. So the delegates eventually did vote for two. They did decide that two houses they were going to put two houses. They were going to have a House of Representatives and a Senate. But they disagreed about how many representatives or votes each state would have in each house. So you've got the two houses, but how many representatives in each would there be? So the Virginia plan wanted it to be based on population. So the more people you had in your state, the more votes you had, or the more representatives that would vote for you would have. But the New Jersey plan, which was another very important plan, only wanted one vote per state. So each state was equal in every vote. Because you figure if you have a law and you have 20 Virginia representatives, but you only had 3 Rhode Island representatives, and Rhode Island doesn't think a law should pass, but Virginia does, it's not very equal. And that's where they were having their disagreements. And everybody had pros and cons to both sides. And it was a heated debate. Heated debate means it was argued for a long time and people got very angry, and then they come back to it and they get angry again and they come back to it until finally a compromise was suggested. And that was that one of the houses, since there's going to be 2, one house of the votes be based on population. So that's the House of Representatives, and this is still the issue today. The House of Representatives is based on population. The more population that a state has, the more votes they have in the House of Representatives. The other house, the Senate, each state only gets 1 vote. There's only 1 representative there that votes for them. So it was what is known today as the Great Compromise, because people finally had to just kind of swallow their pride and realized that nothing was going to get accomplished if they didn't find a solution and meet in the middle. And that's what this was. This was a great compromise. And honestly, it was one of the most revolutionary and greatest ideas they ever had, because this is still one of the biggest reasons why our government is so successful today, because we still have a House of Representatives and we still have a Senate. And there's another compromise we're going to just kind of talk about really quickly. I wish we could spend more time on this. But it's called the 3/5 compromise. And remember, I've talked to you throughout the year that history is not always pretty. Sometimes there's a lot of ugly in our history, and American history is no different. There were choices and decisions that were made that weren't always fair, and we look back on it and it can make us sad, but it's also important to see how far we've come and to learn from our mistakes. And one of those kind of ugly parts of our history is called the 3/5 compromise. And it has a lot to do with slavery. Well, it's all about slavery. So the South, the southern states used slavery in their plantations. We talked about that briefly at the beginning of the American Revolution. And slavery was still legal in the southern states, but the northern states didn't have slavery. The northern states had already kind of wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to actually talk about slavery at the Continental Convention, but they did know that if they even suggested that slavery be removed as a legal thing, because it was still considered legal, then the people of the southern states, the delegates of the southern states would just leave, and they wouldn't be able to ratify their constitution. They wouldn't be able to move forward, because all of the southern states would leave, because they did not believe in ending slavery. And so they didn't even try to talk about it. They didn't even suggest it. Yet, in the future, that does get suggested. The questions they dealt with, though, was if enslaved workers counted as part of the population. So when we're talking about votes in the House of Representatives, it's all based on population. The more people you have in your state, the more votes you have. The thing is the North argued, kind of was planting the seed of how unfair their policy was on slavery, is the North said that the enslaved people should not count as a person, if the southern states claimed that those enslaved workers were just property. So they shouldn't count as a population at all. But the southern states wanted votes. So they actually insisted that the enslaved workers be counted as people, like they are people, so they should be counted as people. And we know this to be true. But it was the debate here that the southern slave owners thought of those people as property, and those slaves wouldn't have been able to vote for their representatives. Women weren't allowed to vote for representatives either, but we'll get there at another date. But they were kind of trying to suggest that if they're property, they don't count as a population. But the southern states needed more people to count to get more votes. So they said yes, they did. And this is where they met yet another compromise, because this was one where neither side was going to get their way. So they met in the middle. And what they decided is that when figuring another number of representatives a state would have, for every 5 enslaved workers, they only counted as 3 people. So that's why it's called the 3/5 compromise. So if you had 15 enslaved people, they only counted as 5, because there was only 5 votes there between the 15. It was the 3/5 compromise. And it's a sad part of our history, and this was eventually amended. And that's one of the neat things about our Constitution, is it's called a living document. It can always change. It's not very easy to change, but it does, and it has, for the better. So the convention finally completed their work. They met their compromises, and there was just some very good details that they needed to complete to get the Constitution ready to ratify. Ratify means to be approved. So there were some questions that remained. So they moved forward to complete what they were there to do after they've met their compromises. And there were a lot of questions that they had to make decisions on. And some of those were like, how long should a member of the House of Representatives serve? They decided on 2 years. Because after 2 years, if the people did not agree with how their representative was doing their job, they could vote for another one. What should the term of office be for a member of the Senate? So this is the other House of Congress. And they decided on that one to be 6 years. How many senators should each state have? Two. So each state, no matter how big the population, every state has 2 senators. And how many presidents should there be at one time? Believe it or not, that was something that was debated. Should there be 3? Should there be 2 presidents? And it was decided eventually that there was only going to be one, which is why today we still only get one president at a time. And there was a reason for that, and it was because everyone in that room at the Continental Convention knew who their president was going to be, their first one, and that was going to be George Washington. He was admired, and people loved him, and they knew that that was who they wanted to lead their country to begin with. And they decided on one president, and that president would serve for 4 years. And how should the Constitution be amended? So how should it be allowed to make changes? Because they knew it shouldn't be easy. It should be harder than passing a law. But the thing is it shouldn't be impossible, because that's one of the reasons the Articles of Confederation failed, is you just couldn't make amendments to it. It was impossible because you had to get 100% permission from the states. So they needed a way to make amendments, but make it so it wasn't super hard to make the amendments. The decision was made to amend the Constitution. So every time they make amendments or add to it or change it, 2/3 of each of the houses of Congress, and 3/4 of all the states have to approve the amendment before it becomes a constitution. So it's like a majority rule. 3/4 of the states have to say, yes, we want that amendment to go into the Constitution. And 2/3 of each house, the House of Representatives and the Senate, they have to vote yes, 2/3 for something to be amended. So that's pretty hard to get that many people to agree on something. And so when there's that many people to agree, then it probably should go in the Constitution, because this is a government that's ran by the people. So that's what they came up with there. And they also debated on this, if the Constitution should be the supreme law of the land. And the reason what this means is they questioned is what would happen if part of a state's constitution disagrees with the national constitution. So if a state passes a law that disagrees with something that the national constitution says, it would not be okay, because then the states could end up ignoring the Constitution altogether. If the states could just say, I don't like that law in the Constitution, I'm going to do my own thing, what's the point of even having it? So they knew that they needed to make something in there that said the states were not allowed to do that. So they decided that the Constitution was going to be the supreme law of the land. What that means is that the state says, if the state says one thing and the Constitution says the other, what the Constitution says goes, always. The Constitution is always the one that wins the argument. It's not something that happens often. So they had some final decisions. Should the Constitution include a Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights is a list of the rights of citizens to make it clear that the new national government would not interfere with them. So it sounds like, yeah, why wouldn't you put the Bill of Rights in? So these Bill of Rights would include things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to peacefully assemble. All of those things are considered they're just the Bill of Rights. They're a list of things that citizens, that if it's written down, it's clear. Those are their liberties, they cannot be taken away. Some delegates thought that the Constitution should have that Bill of Rights, no question asked. It should be in there. But a lot of them felt that the state constitutions already protected them, so why would they don't need to include it, because the states were protecting them anyway. And so at the end, they actually decided not to include the Bill of Rights. And this ended up to be a huge mistake. After 4 months, the Constitution was complete. Guys, this took 4 months for these guys to come up with all the rules, all the ideas, and write it down. And it was now on to get ratified. And ratified means to be approved by the states. And this is the preamble, the beginning of the Constitution, and I'm going to read it out loud because I feel like you just need to hear what it says. And you can see this in Washington, D.C. They have this in a museum there. So it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, meaning peace, provide for the common defense, meaning to protect, promote general welfare, meaning to make sure that everybody is treated fairly, and secure the blessings of liberty, meaning everybody has the same freedoms, to ourselves and our posterity, to do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And what was so neat about this is it wasn't just a state constitution. They were officially the United States of America. Well, I say that, but they weren't yet. Each state had to approve this. They actually had to get a certain number of states, and I'm going to tell you that here in a minute. So the Constitution was written, it was signed, and now the states had to approve it. So would the states approve the Constitution? All Americans in every state were given the opportunity to read the Constitution. And it quickly appeared that many wanted the Constitution. Many agreed with it and thought the idea was great, but others didn't want it at all. Those who wanted it to be approved, they were called Federalists. They're the ones that wanted the Constitution, and they wanted the Constitution and they were ready to ratify it quickly. Those were Federalists. But those who didn't want it to be approved and they wanted to stay under the Articles of Confederation, they were called Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists had three arguments. They had three of them. First, they said that the Constitutional Convention was supposed to recommend only changes to the Articles of Confederation. They were saying that it wasn't right for the men to go in there and just throw the Articles of Confederations away. The whole convention was supposed to be just to amend, not change, or not throw it away, and so they felt like it was heavy-handed. They thought it was sneaky of the delegates just to throw out the articles. They also argued that the convention had created a too powerful central government, and they didn't want another Great Britain. They were worried about that. And they finally argued that the convention failed to include a Bill of Rights. Remember where I said that was kind of a mistake? This they thought was a direct threat to people's liberties. They said if it was not written down in the Constitution, then what's going to stop a government from threatening those liberties? And they had a plan, and their plan was to delay the ratification. They thought the longer it took, soon more and more people would realize that they shouldn't ratify the Constitution. They thought that they could buy time by having the states call for another constitutional convention. So they wanted a new convention where things could be discussed and debated yet again. And we already know how long it took to do the first one. But Federalists, they wanted the Constitution approved, and they wanted it done quickly because they thought the quicker it would be, then soon it would just be in and nobody could argue with it. Now, some of the leading Federalists were Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. They were they were the ones that wanted to have the convention in the first place. They wrote a lot of newspaper articles trying to convince every state to approve the Constitution as fast as possible. So, each state had their own convention where they talked about the Constitution. And they decided whether they were going to vote or not. And there needed to be 9 states out of 13 to approve the Congress. The Constitution. They did not need every state to say yes. They only needed 9 of them. 9 out of 13. So if they got 9, the Constitution could go into effect. There were 5 that voted yes right away. Delaware was one of the first ones. Then it was Pennsylvania, then New Jersey, and then Georgia, a southern state, soon voted yes. And Connecticut made it 5 votes for yes, and it was quick. And people were getting excited about that. But Massachusetts was kind of tricky. This was the hardest state to get to ratify because the Anti-Federalist movement was really strong there. They were stuck on the absence of the Bill of Rights. They just could not get past the fact that the freedoms of people, the Bill of Rights, was not in the Constitution. So the Federalists thought we could solve this problem right now. Rather than to keep explaining why they didn't put a Bill of Rights in, they chose to yet again compromise. It's a big word in American history. And they said that if Anti-Federalists joined in ratifying the Constitution, they would put a Bill of Rights in the Constitution for them. And because they promised that, Massachusetts then voted yes. So now we have 6. And so more states voted yes pretty quickly. Soon, Maryland voted yes, and then South Carolina. So that's, what is that? That's 7. And the problem was that that made 8 states in favor of the Constitution. But the problem was that the 2 biggest and most important states hadn't voted yes yet. Without at least one of those states, the new nation would be very shaky. They might have a lot of states that agreed to it, but the 2 biggest and most influential ones might not agree. So even though New Hampshire voted yes, making it 9, so the 2 states they were waiting on was New York and Virginia. Even though New Hampshire voted, making it 9 yes votes, meaning that the Constitution could go into effect, people were still waiting to hear from Virginia. Patrick Henry, remember him? He was an anti-federalist, and James Madison was a federalist. They continued to give speeches and debate back and forth, back and forth. James Madison himself declared that he would work to add the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, and when he did that won over Virginia, and they ended up voting yes. And so that was enough states to get the Constitution. The Constitution was ratified. So let's talk about the Bill of Rights real quick. Madison did keep his promise. He was elected as a representative, and he went right to work. He introduced his proposed amendments. He wrote many of them in June of 1789. And after a lot of debate, most of those were adopted and sent to the states for approval. There's 10 of them actually that got approved. These 10 rights became known as the Bill of Rights, and I'm just going to list a few of those here. They say that the national government, what they say to the national government, the rules, that these are the basic rights of people, and the government cannot take them away no matter what. It's written on paper, so it cannot, it's a contract. So some of these freedoms are things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press to print what it wishes, freedom to assemble peaceably. Government cannot illegally enter and search your home. Search your home. There are 4 other amendments that make sure that people that get accused of a crime get a fair trial. So there's a lot. These 10 amendments are just the basic rights of people, and government cannot even touch those rights. And so it was time to celebrate. The Constitution was officially the Constitution of the United States. And that was 200 years ago. So let's talk about today. What does it mean? So is it still going strong? Is the Constitution still working? Would the Founding Fathers still recognize today the American government they set out to create? Well, the world has changed a lot. I'm not sure if they would hardly even know what to think of our country, what they would think if they saw all of the airplanes, highways, trucks, skyscrapers, and all the super crowded cities. But they would see their government when American citizens debate who to vote for, argue against a school board's new plan, or discuss what they see in the news. If they saw us vote for our representatives and voting on bills and laws, those men would definitely see their dreams in action. So why has it worked so well? One reason is that the Constitution doesn't try to say or do too much. It's just a framework. It's a laid framework that didn't include details that wouldn't matter in the future. Because they knew that time was going to change and things were going to happen, and they didn't want to write any laws that wouldn't mean anything 200 years later. So that's important because if they said, here's an example, if they said exactly 30,000 people is how many you needed, um, sorry, if they said that each representative represented exactly 30,000 people, with how our population has grown, there would be over 9,000 members of the House of Representatives. So what I mean by that is they didn't load it up and make a lot of rules that won't make any sense. So that's what I was saying. The Constitution says that a representative for each state represents at least 30,000 people. But if they said exactly 30,000 people, then that's how many representatives we would need. So they made it very kind of open-ended. There's other reasons. They had guiding principles. It has served America well because it is built on 4 strong principles. First, government gets its power from the consent of the people being governed. The people have to give permission. Basically, it's we the people rule. We do that by voting for representatives, and we re-elect them if we like them and vote for someone else if we don't. A second guiding principle is that it's limited. The government is limited. The central government has a lot of power, but it also has a lot of rules that they cannot break, so they can't get too powerful. And third, the separation of powers. Responsibilities in our government are split between 3 branches of government, and none is more powerful than the other, and they can all check and balance each other. And fourth, federalism. This is a big one. The system of dividing powers between the national government and the state government. The split between the two is also why it's worked so well, because our country has grown so much, and so state government is very important, and it's important for both states to be divided, and each government does the job that it's the best at. There's also another reason why it's been so successful, and it's the American people. We have respected the Constitution, and we have taken care to preserve it. And in return, the Constitution has taken care of us. And that came from your student reader. So that is the end of our Constitution unit. I hope that you've gained a really good respect for what these founding fathers did, because they did create something amazing. We are a strong country because of our government. And our government is so successful because these men were just truly brilliant. And what is so great about our Constitution is what it's called is a living document. We can change it, we can amend it to make it work for the people of our country. And we've done that several times. We got rid of slavery. We allowed everybody the freedom to attend schools. Everybody of every color, any religion, everybody has the freedom to go to school. And that's part of our government. Our government did that because of the Constitution. So we've made changes because the world has changed, and but no matter how much change happens, we can always rely on the Constitution to guide our government to do the right thing and do the right thing for us, because we really are the ones that are ruling our country. So now what I want you to do is I want you to complete your exit ticket in Google Classroom. Let me know if you have any questions, and tomorrow we are going to be taking your end of unit assessment on Mastery Connect. Have a great day.